This program comes from the Guthrie's production of The Master Butcher's Singing Club, a world premiere adaptation by Marcia Norman based on the novel by Minnesota author Louise Erdrich. Performances begin September 11th. More at GuthrieTheater.org.
With thanks to Minnesota voters, arts reporting and programming on Minnesota Public Radio is supported in part by the Minnesota Legacy Amendments Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund.
For the millions of students who return to the classroom this week, How We Learn is a valuable tool. But are there ways to learn more efficiently? It's mid-morning on Minnesota Public Radio News. Carrie Miller's away. I'm Kate Smith. There's been a boom in brain science. We're learning about how the brain works, how we process information, how different that is from person to person. But what do we know about how we learn? The start of the school year seems like a good time to find out. Cognitive science and educational neurology can tell us plenty about the learning process. Are those findings changing how we teach or study? Is there such a thing as a good study habit? This morning, we'll talk with Roddy Roediger, the James McDonald Distinguished University Professor of Psychology at Washington University. He's on the line with us this morning from St. Louis. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's great to have you. Thanks for your time today.
You're glad to be here.
And Sashank Varma is here in the studio with us. He's a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology here at the University of Minnesota. Thanks for your time today.
Oh, you're welcome.
Roddy Roediger, I wanted to start with you. It seems like there are lots of things. It's sort of those stereotypes about how to study so we can retain information. You know, those sort of old-fashioned, find a quiet place, make sure it's all clean, focus on one thing at a time. How much of what we know about how the brain works really supports the notion of those traditional learning and studying habits that many of us may still employ?
Well, that's a very good question. That I think finding the quiet place is a great idea, and not be distracted by iPods and computers and so forth. If you can find that quiet place, that's good. But many of the other techniques, students don't find that quiet place very often. If you watch them, they're sitting in the library listening to iPods and drinking coffee and talking to their friends. But if they can find that quiet place, many of the habits they use at the university level, the high school level, every level, are less effective than they could be. To give you an example, I teach at a university, and we've done surveys of our students asking, how do you prepare for a test? Imagine you have a test in, say, political science coming up in 2 weeks. How do you prepare? And the standard answer is they try to read their book, they read their notes, they highlight or underline, and then they repeatedly reread the information they think they will retain.
And I bet a lot of it happens in a 24-hour period before the test.
Well, that's a problem too, yes. That's absolutely a problem too, the cramming at the last moment. But what we find is that actually if students do other things besides simply repeatedly reread, they can retain the information much better and for much longer periods of time. And so
things such as?
Let me give you just 3 or 4 examples. One is you mentioned concentrating on just one subject for a long time. And we find that it's better if students switch among subjects. If you have 3 things coming up, history, political science, and physics, say, that you switch among them. You don't just spend hour after hour grinding away at physics, but it helps you if you interleave study of other materials. And the other main recommendation is students rarely test themselves. They rarely say to themselves, shut the book and say, what have I just learned? Or look at the end of the chapter and see the questions that are there and say, okay, if let me use psychology since at least I can come up with examples there. So if I have to know what Pavlovian conditioning is after I've read this chapter, can I shut the book and give a description of Pavlovian conditioning? Because that's what you'll actually have to do on the test. You will have to not just reread something that might seem very familiar if I've read about Pavlovian conditioning 3 times, but if I've never practiced pulling it out of memory, of retrieving it, then I might not be able to get it on the test, especially if it's an essay-type test and not a multiple-choice type test. So practicing retrieval we find to be a very effective technique for several reasons. One being it actually enhances retention. Once you've practiced retrieving something, it makes it much easier to retrieve in the future. Second, when you do that, it lets you know what you don't know. That is, if you test yourself, you can find out what areas you're weak in, and then you can focus your study efforts on the things you don't know.
Sure.
And finally, of course, what several of us have gone to in our classes, university classes are notorious for not giving many tests, because usually people think tests don't have any impact, or people are opposed to testing because professors don't like to grade them, students don't like to take them. So many universities, you have like a mid-semester test and a final exam.
The big ones, yep. Mm-hmm.
But we've gotten so we just give daily quizzes.
I just heard a universal groan go up.
Right. But actually it goes up at the beginning of the semester, but by the end of the semester the groans have gone away, because for the first time in their lives they've kept, the way I and several of my colleagues do it is at the last 5 or 10 minutes of each class, we have a quiz, but that means you have to have read the material. The quiz is on the material assigned for that day, for the lecture that you've just heard, and then because there's so many quizzes, they don't count for much, any particular one. If you blow it, you're not in bad shape. We actually usually drop the bottom two. But what it does is force you to keep up with the course, to keep thinking about it, and not to do what you mentioned just a moment ago, which is to concentrate all your study efforts just the day or two before the test. Because this way it keeps you studying evenly across the semester. We still have the big test too, and they count for a lot, but the daily quizzes seem to keep students up with the course.
Shashank Varma, what's the science that underlays something like shift from subject to subject instead of being really laser focused on the physics? Look at history, look at physics, and then spend 10 minutes on French. Can you help us understand the sort of science around why that helps us learn?
Well, there are probably a couple of findings that really explain why that works. One finding is the idea that when you memorize a fact or a piece of information, it's not just the content, the semantic content of the information you're committing to memory. It's also something about the context in which you're studying it. You're studying it in a particular place, you feel a particular way. And so if you study for a test in just one context, maybe the day before in your apartment, all you're going to have to rely on when you go into the test is those sort of contextual details. You'll only have the information encoded in one way. Whereas if you study that information in several places across several days, some days you were sad, some days you were here, some days you were there, and there's a greater chance that context and one of the ways in which you studied it is going to overlap with the context where you're tested. And so you sort of get this benefit of the extra stuff, the non-semantic information of what you're studying kind of helps you. It's a bit counterintuitive, but classroom demonstrations, you can actually show this in classes. You don't have to run a sophisticated experiment. I think the other piece of it that's really important, and some of the research that Dr. Roediger has done, is that you don't just learn information, you also have to learn when it's applicable. So there's lots of knowledge you have, but a lot of it is inert in some sense. You can't retrieve it when you need it. And so when you study, when you interleave information, you move from math problems to physics problems to English problems, you don't not only learn the specific content, but you get a better sense of, okay, under what conditions am I going to need this content in the future? And so that really gives you a better chance of retrieving it at test.
It's mid-morning on Minnesota Public Radio News. I'm Kate Smith. This hour, we're talking about learning, studying, how the brain works. What are your best techniques? Are you a student, young or old? Do you cram for those exams? We'd love to hear your tips, your questions about how brain science, studying, and learning intersect. Give us a call this morning. It's 1-800-242-2828. That's 800-242-2828. Or in the Twin Cities, the number 651-227-6000. 651-227-6000. Online, you can go to mprnewsq.org and click on Send Us a Question. Roddy Roediger, testing. You mentioned this daily quiz concept, and in my reading for our conversation, I was really struck by how much it seems like a lot of the intersection between this educational psychology point and retention of information relies, as you said, about that retrieval of knowledge. So are there ways that tests can help us retrieve important pieces of knowledge? In other words, I'm thinking about the range of different tests. Is a multiple choice test as good about doing that as maybe one where we have to write down an answer ourselves?
That's a great question. What we find in our research is that tests that require production, so short answer or short essay or even long essay questions, seem to provide, they help the students to organize the information better. They require more retrieval effort. It's more effortful to retrieve things from memory that way, and that seems to have a greater impact on later retention, that the effects seem to last much longer. Multiple choice tests actually do, you can learn from them, especially if they're given with feedback. The one danger with tests like multiple choice and true-false tests, which are sometimes popular, I think they've decreased in popularity over the years, but I can't find any statistics to show that. But those tests, as we well know, they provide you with lots of wrong answers, and we know you learn from tests. So if you, say, are taking a true-false test and you are suddenly exposed to lots of false information, well, later on you might not remember that. Even if you judge it as false at the time, you might remember, well, I read that somewhere, and forget that it was on a multiple choice test and it was a false item. Same thing with, with true-false tests, it was a wrong item. Same thing happens on multiple choice tests. If you take a multiple choice test and you get a wrong answer and that answer is not corrected, well, just like you can learn positive things from tests, you can learn negative things from tests. So I would strongly encourage everyone to always give feedback on multiple choice tests to correct any erroneous answers that people have. And it's surprising how few people do that, because in the multiple choice world, it's very difficult to make those items. And certainly at the university level, professors do not want their test banks to be given out because they like to use some of the same items year after year.
Sashak Varma, something to add?
Well, another point we're kind of missing here is the idea that, so there's different kinds of tests, right? Multiple choice, short answer, essays. And the way your chances of retrieving information for a given test are a function of how you studied. So if you're studying for a test which you know is going to be an essay test, you really should be studying the material by writing, by, posing questions to yourself and trying to come up with long, thoughtful answers to those questions. Whereas if you're just studying for a test that's going to be multiple choice or fill in the blank, then it's really just about brute retrieval. And some of the techniques that we've been talking about are more helpful there. And this is an idea called transfer appropriate processing. It's been around for a long time. Dr. Roediger is one of the guys that really developed that idea, but actually it originates with a fellow named John Bransford who went to Hamline College here in Minnesota, did his PhD at the University of Minnesota. It's still one of the best ways to think about testing, making sure there's a match between how you study and how you test.
I want to bring some callers in on the conversation. Kate is calling from Chanhassen this morning. Hi, Kate. Welcome to the conversation.
Good morning. See, I was doing some tutoring, volunteer tutoring years ago in Australia, and the group that I worked with were very into brain gym, and they would have the kids stand up before the tutoring session and do exercises like having their right hand try to meet their left foot behind their back and different things like that were actual crossover, physical crossover exercises. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that affects and testing?
Sashank
I'll
Varma?
take my answer off the air.
Okay, thanks, Kate. Sashank?
Yeah, so this is actually a topic that I wrote a paper about recently, not brain gym in particular, but there's a real push by marketing folks, publishers, to supposedly take what we know about neuroscience and reform educational materials and instruction. And Brain Gym is a program where they claim there's certain exercises you can do, like, as she said, sort of twisting your body, or that's supposed to get the left and right hemispheres talking to one another. Or they have other sort of strange recommendations, and pretty widespread in schools. My daughters, when we lived in California, were actually doing this as part of their schooling. And, as far as I can tell, I mean, given my knowledge of neuroscience, there's absolutely no basis for these kinds of exercises. If you look at the literature for that company puts out, it seems to be a bit more based in like physiology, exercise physiology. But given what we know about neuroscience, it's very hard to believe that you can get the left and right hemispheres, for example, talking to one another by simply holding your body in a contorted
How
angle.
you move. Eric is calling from River Falls, Wisconsin. Hi, Eric.
Yeah, hello. I am a professor at the University of Wisconsin River Falls, and just in my third year now. But in the past few years, I've had some experiments that I've tried, based upon some of the research that I did in grad school about the types of learning styles. And I find that, myself, I'm a kinetic learner, somebody that needs interaction and some physical component to the learning process. And so I tried this experiment before some midterms and finals that it kind of, in a way, is related to kind of popular culture and how I grew up, and that is the idea of game shows. And with game shows, you watch them, and there's, pieces of interesting trivia, and it's exciting. So anyway, I've just found that by taking like a game show approach, I have this kind of game that I developed loosely patterned after Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, called Who Wants to Be a Winner. And, I quiz the students that are, in different areas related to the content,
What
and
do
they
you
get
teach?
lifelines. And anyway, it seems to be really successful, based upon not doing that versus doing it, and their area of retention for that.
Eric, what do you teach?
I teach digital film and television, and it also includes media studies and film history.
Huh, interesting. Roddy Roediger, what do you think about the notion of these learning styles? I know, a lot of popular culture, at least, has accepted that some people are visual learners. Eric is a kinetic learner. There are auditory learners, tactile learners. The list probably goes on, and I don't know. But is there a correlation? Is there a connection to how we take in information that is transferable to the style of teaching?
Well, that's certainly an important question, because this is such a widespread belief. There was a recent report authored by Hal Pashler, the lead author, Mark McDaniel, and Robert Bjork, and Doug Rohrer were the four people who wrote the report. And they examined the learning styles concept, and what they found was that people have very strong preferences for how they learn, that they might prefer to read, or they might prefer to hear, or they might prefer a kinetic learning style. But when they examine the evidence, do people really learn better when you match the learning style? So if I say I'm an auditory learner and I really prefer to hear things rather than to read them, that might be my preference, but do I really do better if I hear them rather than read them? And there they couldn't find any evidence to support the learning styles idea, that, in other words, people have this very strong preference, and it might affect them just through interest doing that. But as far as there being a real privileged access in the brain, if I say I'm an auditory learner, I learn best by hearing things, not by reading them. The evidence for that claim was very weak, and they argued that we're spending much too much time and money worrying about learning styles rather than trying to figure out techniques that will benefit all learners. And to some extent, the tiny bit of evidence there is suggests that if you are weak in some areas, say I prefer hearing things and not reading them, that maybe what I should really do is try to boost myself on the modalities of learning in which I'm weaker, to bring those up to speed. So it's a very controversial area. There's a lot of companies, just like the Brain Gym product, there are a lot of companies that are marketing products to determine people's learning styles,
right.
And yet the evidential base for it in the scientific literature is lagging behind where the practice is.
Shashank Verma?
Yeah, I think that assessment's exactly right. We see another example of where the industry is sort of leading the science. Although, psychologists have known for a long time that people vary in their aptitudes for different kinds of material. So how well you do on a math test does not necessarily correlate with how well you do on a verbal test or a spatial test. And so I think this is one of those topics that requires more research. I think certainly the claims that are being made out there by industry are not supported. And maybe people's intuitive sense of what their learning style is. They've been told, are you a visual thinker or whatever. That might be the wrong way to cut people's abilities. But I think it maybe is an area that merits future research.
So is any of this brain science knowledge filtering into the classroom, into classroom materials in ways that aren't just sort of, trying to make money off of the Brain Gym or trying to make money off of various kinds of learning?
Well, so we're right at the cusp of where that's going to happen. We had a sort of a first generation of overblown claims, and I think hopefully those are dying down. There's research now on topics like reading difficulties like dyslexia or math difficulties, what's called dyscalculia, that's just pushing up to the point where they're developing programs to, based on what we know about maybe the neural dysfunction in folks with low math performance, we're just developing programs to maybe remediate those specific skills we think are wrong. So, for example, for the case of math, which is sort of the newer case, some portion of the population with otherwise equal access to good educational resources and high IQ, they don't do well on math tests. Why is that the case? And so basic research is sort of honed in on the idea that they don't have a good sense of, number magnitude, that 5 is less than 8. It's not an intuitive concept for them. Or maybe the difficulty is mapping those symbols, the symbol for 5 and 8, to a sense of what it means to be 5, somewhat smaller than what it means to be 8. So these are sort of core deficits these kids might have, and right now research is sort of developing games that these kids can play to strengthen those kinds of connections. And we sort of know the neural basis of the deficit, so I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see very interesting studies that push into the classroom some of this understanding and maybe make a difference. But we're not quite there yet.
Sarah is calling us this morning from Minneapolis. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, good morning. I have a question and comment also. I'm one of those people who really like to study under pressure when I know that I have 24 hours, 48 hours before the exam. I think that's when I really do well and study and memorize almost everything. And there's this technique that I learned from a classmate of mine, and she used to call it auditioning for exam. When we get together, we read it out loud and look ourselves in the room and walk back and forth, ask each other question out loud. And somehow that stays with me. So I was wondering if you guys can give me a comment why that works when you read it out loud with someone and they ask you a question and you ask them a question and it goes back and forth.
So are you actually testing and quizzing each other, or are you just reading material from your texts out loud to each other?
We started by reading first, but we started reading out loud to each other.
Right.
And then after that, we started asking questions. She was wanted to be an actress, and she went on a couple auditions, and we sort of like auditioning. And
so you're working your way off of the book, in other words.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
But somehow it stays with me. Whatever material we cover during that time, it always stays with me. But I tried to do it on my own by myself, and it doesn't work. But it helps if you have someone else in the room. You can bounce on an idea and ask questions, and we'll read it to you out loud.
Thanks for the call, Sarah. Interesting. Roddy Roediger, does this play into the maybe testing and retrieval that you were talking about earlier?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, I imagine the reading out loud to each other is not as effective as the asking each other questions and then explaining to one another the same, the concepts that are under study. That I think all teachers have had the experience of when you have to prepare material to teach it to someone else, you really learn it better. And so you're learning both as being the teacher and the learner in the situation she describes. That I thought I knew statistics really well until I had to teach a course in it. Then I suddenly discovered, whoa, I've got a long way to go here when I have to explain it to other people. And then after I had taught the course, I understood so much better. So I think, and we're just doing research now trying to look at that point. But I think that's one thing that makes study groups when they work, if students study in study groups and they really ask each other questions, and then when somebody does not know something well, the others fill in the blanks. The evidence is still coming in on that, but I suspect that's a very good technique. The danger with study groups, of course, is they just turn into bull sessions where everybody just chats. But but if they can stay on focus, I think they are a great example of retrieval practice working in effect. And maybe Dr. Varma would be able to offer some comments on why that is. But.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I was going to pick up on a point you made about how you really only master material once you've had to teach it. Actually, and I'm glad you're doing work on this, there's a couple of recent studies out of Stanford where they ran exactly this experiment. You either spent an amount of time studying a topic or half that amount of time studying it and half that amount teaching it. And then you got to see the person who you taught take a quiz. And there's this idea that now this material is high stakes for you. You're going to, in some ways, be judged by their performance. And they found increased learning when you spent less time studying it yourself, but actually taught it and then had to see the consequences of teaching it. And this might sort of draw in some aspects of social psychology or affective psychology, not just cognitive psychology. Why is this a really motivating, highly engaging thing to teach other people? And so, like I said, these are new findings.
Interesting. We're talking this hour about learning, about brain science, about cognition, and we'd love to hear from you. Give us a call. Tell us what works for you when you're studying, your study habits. How about those exam cram sessions? Do they really work for you? Give us a call, 1-800-242-2828. That's 800-242-2828. In the Twin Cities at 651-227-6000. 651-227-6000, or online, mprnewsq.org, and click on Send Us a Question.
Programming is supported by the Shakopee Metawakan Sioux community, who have given 254 defibrillators to charitable organizations, schools, and others. To request an AED for your organization, you can go to shakopeedakota.org.
The world's biggest classical music festival, the BBC Proms, is coming to a close. We've got your front row ticket. It's the infamous last night of the Proms, live from London this Saturday afternoon at 1 by Classical Minnesota Public Radio.
From Minnesota Public Radio News, I'm Phil Picardi. President Obama is urging the Florida pastor who plans to burn the Koran on Saturday to call it off. Obama has told ABC News the action would be a recruitment bonanza for al-Qaeda. The president referred to the planned burning as a stunt and a destructive act that could greatly endanger U.S. troops. The pastor of a small church says he's burning the Islamic holy book to strike back at militant Islam. A German ship held by Somali pirates has reportedly been retaken with the help of U.S. Marine commandos. The Navy says it happened before dawn with no injuries reported and 9 prisoners taken. The ship was commandeered just a day earlier. The number of people signing up for unemployment benefits is at its lowest level in 2 months. The Labor Department says that's an encouraging sign that companies aren't resorting to deeper layoffs. New claims for unemployment plunged last week by a seasonally adjusted 27,000. Some of the roughly 3,500 people evacuated because of a wildfire near Boulder, Colorado will be allowed to check on their homes today, but others will have to wait while firefighters struggle to expand containment of the 6,200-acre blaze beyond the current 10%. At least 135 homes have been destroyed by the fires. More than 400 nurses at Duluth St. Luke's Hospital have overwhelmingly approved a new contract. That word from the nurse union, which counted votes last night. Another 900 nurses and Duluth's SMDC Essentia Hospital will vote on a tentative contract agreement tomorrow. Freezing temperatures have returned to Minnesota. The National Weather Service says some residents awoke to frost this morning. Temperatures dropped into the low 30s across the Iron Range, Arrowhead, and northwestern Wisconsin. That's even though summer does not end until the 22nd of this month. Currently, showers west and south. Temperatures range from the low 40s to the mid-50s. This is Minnesota Public Radio News.
Today's programming is sponsored in part celebrating the marriage of Nicole Moen and Mike Skoglund on the 11th of September. Let the adventure begin. Back to our conversation on Mid-Morning. I'm Kate Smith. We're talking this hour about learning, studying, retaining knowledge, brain cognition, science, you name it. We'd love to hear from you. 1-800-242-2828 or 651-227-6000. How do you like to study? How do you think you retain information the best? That's our conversation today. Roddy Roediger, I wanted to know from you how you think the concept of, this notion of testing helping us learn, and even when we struggle to learn concepts, it seems from some of the research like that very effort, that very notion that what you're trying to retain, trying to get in as new information, new knowledge, that when you go through that struggle, it sticks better.
Yes, that does seem to be the case, that anything that involves more activity in learning, more effort, as long as you eventually are able to achieve the concept and to understand it, does seem to aid your performance. And we, even during study, if you make things somewhat more difficult, it seems to help. One of my colleagues did a study some years ago where he simply had people read textbooks that had chapters with letters omitted, so just letters omitted from words. That slowed down reading a bit. but actually when they took a test later, they actually remembered the information better because they had to work at it a bit more. So there is something about the effort you put into it being proportional to what you get out of it. Now, you can't take that to extremes, of course. We call this a desirable difficulty, that if you make, there's this curious pattern of results that we see from a number of studies, that things that slow down initial learning, they make it harder to achieve, actually have better effects on long-term retention. So just to give you one example, we talked about whether it's better to mass practice at something, whether you do, say you're learning a new motor skill, is it better to do the same thing over and over and over? Well, it turns out you learn it faster if you do it that way than if you practice a number of different skills and you intermix them. So learning is quicker when you just practice the same thing over and over, and it seems easier. Teachers like it better because students get there faster. Students like it better because they feel like they're learning. But then when we test long-term retention, say a few weeks later, students do much worse when they've had this mass practice than when they've had interleaved practice, when they practice one skill, then another skill, then a third skill. And so people in sports and also in music are often told to interleave their practice, not just to do the same thing over and over. And it is this counterintuitive finding, though, because you feel like you're learning faster when you do the same thing over and over repeatedly, and in fact you are. It's just you're not going to retain it as well and be able to use it as well later on. It won't generate what Dr. Varma called transfer-appropriate processing.
I see. Kim is calling us from St. Louis Park this morning. Hi, Kim.
Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. I'm teaching a course on learning and behavior change in therapy, and I was wondering if either of the speakers had any suggestions on new findings on the role of cognition and learning in behavior change.
Therapy, what kind of therapy?
Oh, well, we're looking at a number of different therapies, but if they want to limit it to cognitive or behavioral, that's fine. But just kind of anything about how learning and impacts people's ability to change their behavior.
Roddy Roediger, any thoughts?
In the behavior therapy world, there is one idea that has been very popular for a long time that modern research is undermining it somewhat, and that was the idea of errorless retrieval. There was an idea dating back to B.F. Skinner, who advocated using teaching machines in the school, and he never wanted students to make an error. He thought that was terrible because then you would learn the error. But what happened with the teaching machines and with another area called program learning, which I experienced myself when I was in school, was they made things so easy. You would read a little passage, then you would basically read the passage again with a few words left out and have to fill them in. Well, you never made errors, but you also didn't learn that well because it was so easy and so effortless. So to come back to the point made earlier, it seems like some retrieval effort, some difficulty is necessary for the learning. It's not just a matter of producing a correct response to get the answer. You need to make that response under conditions where you have to exert some effort to make it. You can't just if you just retrieve it from short-term memory, it's not going to have much effect. So that would be one tip for kind of behavior sorts of analyses. I'm not sure that helps with therapy, actually, but
yeah. Jim is on the line now this morning. Hi, Jim. Welcome to our conversation on Mid-Morning.
Hi. I have a daughter in high school, a smart kid, and her grades, almost invariably, she does real well during the school year, and then when it comes to finals, the grades all drop. And it's just interesting to me. I was the opposite. I did poorly in school until I got to the finals, and I always seemed to do real well on exams. And I was just curious about this. I know she's a lot smarter than me, but struggles on exams, and I don't know what can be done.
Shashank Varma, are there things, are there any universals for people who really, can perform well, but that, the pressure of the exam sort of environment really just shuts them down?
Well, certainly people have test anxiety, and I'm sure that it's an individual difference, right? And so maybe the caller didn't feel it as intensely as his daughter. There's interesting research, though, on what causes text anxiety. And I'm just going to, because I'm a cognitive psychologist, I'm going to slant that way. So, for example, we know that if you're taking a test in a subject where people from your group don't tend to do well. And so there's a really interesting study out of University of Chicago about women taking tests in math. And before they took those tests, some women were told, oh, by the way, there's a stereotype and it's not true. And some people were told, oh, there's a stereotype and actually it's true for this test you're about to take. Women don't do as well. And when women take a test, for example, and they're threatened with that stereotype, their performance plummets. And so I don't want to generalize too much, but it could be the case. I mean, does your daughter maybe do well on some tests and other tests not so well? And maybe you can really start thinking about whether it's test anxiety based on these kinds of stereotype threats, as they're called in the literature.
That external influence seems to play a key role in some of this.
Yeah, I think we're finding out that that's part of the picture. I mean, some people just might be anxious on tests.
Kelly's calling from Moorhead this morning. Hi, Kelly. Welcome to Mid-Morning.
Thank you for taking my call. I have two daughters, and both of them have been in elementary school multi-age classrooms where first graders and second graders are together. And is there any evidence that having sort of that combination of different grade levels in a single classroom environment having any impact on learning?
Roddy Roediger, is the learning style different enough with those multi-age classrooms that there would be an effect?
Well, to be honest, I really don't know of any evidence bearing on this one way or the other. I'm sorry to not be able to provide good advice here, but I'm just not aware of evidence about, in my experience at least, it's a relatively uncommon practice to mix children from two different grades in one classroom. I mean, certainly used to be an old practice. 100 years ago, the little schoolhouse where you had many kids of different ages in it. But I don't know of any evidence. Maybe Dr. Varma, since he's an educational psychologist, would have better knowledge than I do.
Well, this is unfortunately a place where I have to say I'm not so knowledgeable as well.
How much does age factor in here? I mean, I'm gonna push the parameters a little bit. We're talking about learning, comprehension, retention. So if somebody learns French, at a teenage years kind of thing, and somebody learns French in their late 20s or 30s, does all of this brain science give us really clear data about how differently people learn?
Well, so there used to be this idea that if you didn't learn a foreign language when you were young, you were going to be hopeless, and there was some speculation that maybe puberty was the time when something changed, and before puberty you can absorb these languages and afterwards not. More recent, and this was the critical period hypothesis. There was a time when you were really primed for language learning. And more recent evidence over the last 15 years has shown, it's more graded than that. There's an advantage to early exposure, but it's not like there's some cliff that you fall off of. So I think that would be that's sort of the undergraduate lesson or undergraduate taking away point that I have for that question.
Roddy Roediger, when you are looking at this body of work and trying to apply this research to the classroom, you talked at the beginning of our conversation about those daily quizzes, the ways that you are really trying to take the body of work and push it past the research into practical application. Why is that fascinating to you? How is it that, it's not happening in very many places from what I can tell. Why are you wanting to do this?
Well, I think it's certainly American education has its difficulties, to put it mildly. And so I think if cognitive psychologists and educational psychologists can find strategies and techniques that will improve things, will all be to the good. I mean, a big problem that we haven't touched on is motivation, that most of the strategies we talk about assume a motivated student, and certainly that's not a guarantee in many of our schools for many, many reasons. I mean, it's not like you can teach a few cognitive strategies and you'll overcome all these different problems, but I think it's certainly a starting place because if you do have students who really want to learn but are having difficulties, we should be able to find strategies that will help them. And certainly many psychologists and educational psychologists in particular, but cognitive psychologists too, are working on this issue. And I think we're making headway, and at least I find when I give talks to teachers that they are receptive. And certainly when I talk to students, I give talks over at our medical school where medical students have to learn just a tremendous, first year of medical school, you're learning all of the different systems of the body, the nervous system, the skeletal system, the muscular system, so forth and so on. And they just have a huge amount of material to master. And if you can give them better techniques to do that and to be able to retrieve the information when they need it, they certainly appreciate it. So I wind up giving lots of talks in those kinds of venues. But I think we can do better, but it's not like we have a magic bullet that suddenly, I mean, too many people are promising magic bullets in education. If only you'll do Brain Gym or whatever it is, we'll solve your problem. It's not going to be that easy. It's multifaceted, and it will take many different kinds of efforts, I think, to achieve improvements in education. I certainly think it's doable and that we have to make the effort.
Shashank Varma, as lots of people talk about reform in education, do you see this, your field, playing a primary role in some of that?
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time. Psychologists, as they turn to the classroom, they get to test their theories. You know, they develop theories of memory and learning on college sophomores using kind of impoverished materials. And to take those kinds of theories and say, do they really work in the classroom? It's a good test of those theories. It's sort of a test that I think a lot of theories are going to fail. Conversely, the other nice thing about it is psychologists, I think, will eventually actually start partnering with educational researchers. You know, educational researchers have a lot of knowledge about how learning actually occurs for complex domains in kind of complicated settings, the kind of settings that not just characterize classrooms, but also the workforce. And so I think there's a whole set of knowledge they have there that psychologists are just sort of they're going to be tapping into soon. So I think it's an exciting time for the future.
Great conversation. We need to close it down here. Roddy Roediger, thanks for your time this morning.
You're welcome.
We've been talking with Roddy Roediger. He's professor of psychology at Washington University in St. Louis. And Shashank Varma, it's great to talk with you too.
Thanks for having me on.
Shashank is a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Minnesota. A Newsmaker segment now. This week, the Mayo Clinic published a study that finds men are more likely to develop pre-Alzheimer's condition called mild cognitive impairment. More than 2,000 residents in Olmsted County participated. The outcome, the rate of cognitive impairment was 1.5 times greater in men than in women. Dr. Ronald Peterson's director of the Mayo Clinic Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. Dr. Peterson, good to have you back on the show.
Thanks, Kate. Pleased to be here.
I wonder, were the findings consistent with what you expected to see with this sample group?
I think the frequency of mild cognitive impairment that we were measuring in Olmsted County was roughly in the anticipated range, but the surprising finding was the greater number of men with mild cognitive impairment than women, because, as you know, there are more women with dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease, than men in general society. So if mild cognitive impairment is sort of the precursor stage, one would expect that there would be more women than men with it, but that's not what we found.
So what does this finding start to send you down in terms of additional paths of inquiry? If it's sort of the antithesis of what you might expect based on the logical outcome, as you say, where do you go next?
Well, I think we need to look at the specific subtypes of mild cognitive impairment. We get a little carried away with this topic at times, and we divide mild cognitive impairment into two basic categories, one called amnestic, which means primary memory impairment, and the other is non-amnestic, where the people do have a cognitive impairment, but memory is not the hallmark. And it turns out that the men tend to have more of the non-amnestic variety as well as the amnestic, but even more so in the non-amnestic variety. And when we look at that, it turns out that there are vascular risk factors that account for some of that non-amnestic type, meaning that men actually have a higher frequency of heart disease, of high blood pressure, diabetes, and smoking history than women do. So it may be that we may learn something about the causes of the mild cognitive impairment, with the implication being there might be some treatable entities, lifestyle modifications, that could have an impact.
Were there any other factors besides gender that seemed to determine this likelihood?
Yes, the other ones were sort of expected. So age being one, of course, the overall phenomenon becomes more frequency with aging, just as we see in Alzheimer's disease. Those individuals with lower education levels are at somewhat greater risk. Again, this is consistent. And interestingly, those individuals who were never married seem to be at a higher risk as well. And again, the explanation of that is not entirely obvious, but these were the other observations.
So does the conclusion suggest the need to rethink any other conclusions?
Well, I think so. The research fits into the bigger picture of Alzheimer's disease research in the country and in the world, actually. And you've probably seen several media reports in the last few weeks or months about the thought of actually adjusting the criteria for Alzheimer's disease, meaning that we may be trying to pick the disease up at an earlier point in time when people are just memory impaired, but they do not meet the full picture of dementia, meaning that they're also functionally impaired because of their cognitive difficulties. So mild cognitive impairment fits right into that niche insofar as it represents people who are memory impaired usually to a greater extent than we would expect for aging, yet they're pretty functional. They're out and about driving their car, paying their bills, doing their taxes, so they look pretty normal to the casual observer, yet their memory is significantly impaired. And the field is now moving back into this range. Can we call people at this earlier stage with potential of developing the full spectrum of Alzheimer's disease, with the purpose being, again, when and if, hopefully when, we develop these disease-modifying therapies that will be able to intervene at that earlier stage.
Now, certainly there exists debate in the world about this precognitive period for Alzheimer's. There are folks who certainly say that this is a natural part of aging, that we are being far too specific in looking at some of this. So as you say, this may require that we adjust some of our criteria for how we approach what this disease is and when it starts. Is this feed the folks who say, come on, this is a part of natural aging?
Sure, exactly. I mean, there are those individuals out there that say that, even go as far as to say that Alzheimer's disease is just a manifestation of aging. But certainly any of us who have had experience with people with Alzheimer's disease, especially in their, say, 60s and 70s, we realize that this is really not typical aging. Many, many people live out their lifespan with quite good cognitive function. So I think that that's a fallacious argument, but it does raise the issue of responsibility on our part. That is, we can't go out and label every aging, forgetful person, like myself, with Alzheimer's disease prematurely, because we cannot afford to be wrong. We can't label, this is a fatal disease. Right. Nobody comes back from Alzheimer's disease. There are no Alzheimer's survivors as such. So you cannot apply this label capriciously or prematurely. So if we do move back to this milder stage of impairment, the mild cognitive impairment stage, we're going to need to fortify our diagnoses with some other imaging and biomarkers that will in fact tell us that the underlying cause of this memory impairment is Alzheimer's disease and not something else like depression, anxiety, medication side effects, things of that nature. So it really, I think it makes the responsibility on the clinician greater to be certain that he or she is making the right call.
Is that tougher, Dr. Peterson, because what we know about this disease and its progression is that it really is so varied from patient to patient? So you can't even, to create this criteria, you can't even suggest that there's a normal progression for all patients from cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's, for instance.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, it is, while there are typical patterns of development of Alzheimer's disease and progression through the stages, it often is quite idiosyncratic. So the criteria have to be mindful of that and have to put the appropriate safeguards in place that, in fact, anybody who's mildly impaired may or may not have Alzheimer's disease. So that's where I think the imaging and the biomarkers will become particularly important because they are relatively specific for the underlying Alzheimer's disease process itself. So that's why we need to as I say, fortify the clinical diagnosis with these other indices.
Since we know that women tend to live longer than men on the average, and this finding is really weighted toward men, more men were found, 1.5 times more men than women had this mild cognitive impairment. Does that suggest that women handle cognitive aging better?
They may handle it better, and they may also transition through this mild stage in a different fashion. That is, it seems like there are more men entering this stage, but the men seem to stay at this stage for a longer period of time. And then, as you mentioned, Kate, women live longer than men, so in fact, it may be that there's a survival effect, that men actually die before they transition on to the full Alzheimer's stage, whereas women appear to come into the stage perhaps somewhat more slowly, but they do not spend as much time in it, and they transition right on to Alzheimer's disease. So there appear to be gender-related patterns of the development of the disease process, and this may give us some insight into the underlying biology and maybe even treatments down the road.
This is a pretty big sample group, wasn't it? More than 2,000?
It was. Initially, we recruited 2,000 people in Olmsted County, and the important aspect of this research, which sometimes gets lost, is that this is what's called a population-based study, which means that it's a true random sample of people aged 70 to 89 in Olmsted County. And these kinds of studies are relatively rare, they're difficult to do, but because the Mayo Clinic and the Olmsted Medical Center provide virtually all of the medical care for the residents of Olmsted County, we know who lives here, and we're able to perform these population-based studies fairly easily. So it's a unique feature of being big medical institutions in a relatively small town.
Do you keep tracking this group then?
Absolutely. We recruited them beginning in 2004. We just finished the first 5 years of our grant cycle. We fortunately, knock on wood, got renewed for another 5 years from the National Institute on Aging, and we'll be following them longitudinally because that's where the real value is. So we looked at these people. This study reports the cross-sectional frequency. Now we need to look at their transitional probabilities, as we call it. That is, how many of the normal people move into mild cognitive impairment, how many of the mild cognitive impairment people move into the dementia stage, and then try to understand those processes.
Fascinating. Really good to check back with you. We'll do it again. Thanks for your time this morning.
Very good, Kate. I appreciate the opportunity.
We've been talking the last few minutes with Dr. Ronald Peterson. He's a neurologist and the director of the Mayo Clinic Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. This week, the Mayo Clinic published a study that finds men are more likely to develop a pre-Alzheimer's condition than women. If you missed any of our conversation, you can go to NPR News Q and click on Mid-Morning to hear the whole conversation.
Each weekday, Minnesota Public Radio News invites you to join the conversation on mprnewsq.org. Even though presidents of both parties have professed respect for Islam, incidents around the country have suggested hostility toward Muslims in recent years. Today's question, is America becoming a less welcoming place for Muslims? Share your answer. Go to mprnewsq.org or send a text to 677-677. We'll share some of your answers this afternoon on All Things Considered.